It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Just me, the woods, and the old family cabin. I hadn't been there in years, not since my dad passed. The place had been sitting empty, waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. I figured a few days away from the city might clear my head. Maybe I'd fix a few things, see if it was even worth keeping. The drive out was familiar but felt different. The trees along the narrow roads seemed taller, darker. The old dirt path leading up to the cabin was worse than I remembered. Deep potholes and overgrown grass. My truck barely made it through without scraping the undercarriage. When I finally pulled up, the place looked the same but older, like it had been holding its breath all these years. The wood was gray and weathered, the front steps sagging slightly. I unlocked the door, and the smell of dust and damp would rush out, wrapping around me like a memory. Inside, everything was just as we'd left it. The old furniture covered in white sheets, the stone fireplace still stacked with logs from the last time we were here. I ran a hand over the wooden table where my dad used to sit, carving little notches into the edge with his pocket knife. It was strange being back, like stepping into a life I'd forgotten. I spent the first few hours cleaning. I dusted off the counters, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and swept up what felt like years' worth of dirt. The cabin had no power, but the generator still worked after a few rough starts. I filled the water tank, made sure the propane stove was working, and set up my sleeping bag on the couch. By the time the sun started setting, I was exhausted. I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no wind in the trees. Just this heavy silence that made me uneasy. Then I heard it. A single branch snapping somewhere in the woods. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe a raccoon. But it didn't move after that. No rustling, no footsteps. Just that single, deliberate snap. I finished my beer and went inside, locking the door behind me. It was probably nothing, but I kept the shotgun close, just in case. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump. I kept imagining someone standing outside, watching. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I was alone out here. There was no one else. The next day, I got up early and started working on the cabin. The front steps were worse than I thought. One of the boards cracked under my weight. I replaced it with some old wood from the shed out back. Took most of the morning. By noon, I was covered in sweat and sawdust. That's when I found the footprints. They were in the dirt, near the side of the cabin. Not mine. Too big, too deep. Someone had been standing there, right near my bedroom window. My stomach dropped. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I felt it. Something was off. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my shotgun and checked the area. The footprints led into the woods but disappeared after a few yards. The ground was too hard, too covered in dead leaves to track. But I knew what I saw. Someone had been here. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I kept checking the tree line, expecting someone to step out at any moment. But no one did. The woods were still and empty. Too empty. That night, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle. I kept the shotgun next to me and left a lantern burning. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up, listening, waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of something scraping against the cabin wall. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath. The sound moved to the window, a faint creaking like someone shifting their weight. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Then silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I finally stood, moving slowly toward the window. The lantern's glow barely reached the glass. I couldn't see anything outside, just darkness. Then I heard footsteps, running. I grabbed the shotgun and threw open the door, stepping onto the porch. My heart was pounding. I aimed into the woods, my breath fogging in the cold air. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I stayed up the rest of the night, listening. But whoever or whatever it was didn't come back. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things, locked up the cabin, and got into my truck. That's when I saw it. A single boot print, right next to my truck door. Deep, fresh. I didn't waste time. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, and that's when I saw him, a man standing at the tree line, dressed in dark clothes, motionless, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I just drove. I never went back. I never planned on spending the night in that cabin. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. I had been driving for hours, longer than I should have, trying to make it to my uncle's place in Montana before dark. But the road stretched on forever, and the exhaustion crept up on me before I knew it. The sky was already bleeding orange and pink when I realized I wasn't going to make it. I didn't have it in me to keep going, not with the way my eyelids kept drooping and my hands felt like they weren't part of my body anymore. That's when I saw it. A small, wooden sign off the side of the road, half covered in vines. Cabins, 2 miles ahead. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than risking an accident. I turned down the gravel path, the tires crunching over loose stones as I made my way deeper into the woods. The further I drove, the darker it got, the towering trees swallowing up the last bit of daylight. The cabins weren't much, just a handful of old wooden structures tucked into the trees, their roofs sagging slightly, paint peeling. The office was a single-room shack with a flickering neon open sign in the window. A man sat behind the counter, eyes sunken, looking like he had seen too many years pass him by. He barely looked up as I walked in, just slid a book across the counter for me to sign. "Cash only," he muttered. I didn't argue. I handed him a few bills, took the key he pushed toward me, and made my way to cabin 3. The moment I stepped inside, I regretted it. The air was stale, heavy, like it hadn't been breathed in for years. The furniture was old, the bedspread covered in a thin layer of dust. But I was too tired to care. I locked the door, dropped my bag by the bed, and collapsed onto the mattress without bothering to pull back the sheets. I woke up to the sound of movement outside. First, I thought it was the wind. The trees groaned, their branches tapping against the walls like bony fingers. But then I heard the crunch of gravel, slow and deliberate. Someone was walking outside my cabin. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. A shadow moved past the thin curtains, stretching long across the floor. I waited, heart hammering, expecting a knock, a voice, something. But nothing came. After what felt like forever, the shadow shifted, and the footsteps moved away, fading into the night. I tried to tell myself it was just another guest, maybe the old man from the office checking on things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had stood there, right outside my door, just watching. Sleep didn't come easy after that. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun barely managed to cut through the thick forest, casting long, pale beams across the floor. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My bag. It wasn't where I left it. It had been right by the bed when I laid down. Now it was sitting by the door, unzipped. I scrambled out of bed, heart pounding, and checked my belongings. My wallet was still there, my phone, my keys, nothing was missing. But someone had been in here. Someone had gone through my things while I slept. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I had kicked the bag in my sleep. Maybe I had left it by the door and just didn't remember. I shoved everything back inside, got dressed, and stepped outside, eager to get away from that place. The old man wasn't in the office when I went to drop off the key. The door was unlocked, the neon sign still flickering, but the room was empty. I waited a few minutes before giving up, setting the key on the counter, and heading back to my car. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, deeper, leading from my cabin to the office. But there was something off about them. The spacing between each step was too wide, as if whoever had made them had been moving unnaturally fast. I didn't wait to figure it out. I got in my car and drove, faster than I should have, not caring about the gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles down the road. I needed to clear my head, to shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The clerk was a woman in her 40s, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. I asked her about the cabins, if she knew anything about them. She went pale. "They closed years ago," she said. "Been abandoned ever since the owner died." I felt the blood drain from my face. I told her that wasn't possible, that I had just stayed there, that I had spoken to the man at the front desk. She just shook her head. "No one's run that place for years." I didn't know what to say. I left the store, got in my car, and drove, not stopping until I was miles and miles away. I don't know who I spoke to that night. I don't know who went through my things. But I do know one thing for sure. I was never alone in that cabin. I never wanted to go up to that cabin. It was my brother's idea. He said it would be nice to get away for a bit, to spend some time in the woods like we used to when we were kids. I wasn't so sure. The cabin belonged to an old friend of his, someone he knew from work. The guy barely used it anymore and offered to let us stay there for the week. My brother, Mark, jumped at the chance. "It'll be good for us," he said, "like old times." I agreed, mostly because I didn't have a good excuse to say no. Life had been stressful, and maybe getting away from it all would help clear my head. So, we packed up our things, loaded up his truck, and headed out to the middle of nowhere. The drive was long, almost 4 hours from the city. The farther we went, the less familiar everything became. The roads got narrower, the trees taller, and the signal on my phone weaker. By the time we turned off the main road onto the gravel path leading to the cabin, I knew we were completely alone. The cabin itself was simple. A small, single-story place with a covered porch and a steeply pitched roof. It looked old but solid. There was a shed out back, a fire pit, and a creek running nearby. Peaceful. At least it should have been. Something about the place put me on edge right away. Maybe it was the silence. The kind of silence that isn't really silent. The wind through the trees, the distant sound of running water, the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the woods. It made me uneasy. Mark didn't seem to notice. We unpacked our things and settled in. The inside of the cabin was about what I expected. Basic. A few pieces of furniture, an old wood-burning stove, and a small kitchen with outdated appliances. There was no TV, no internet. Just a radio sitting on a shelf, covered in dust. Night came fast. We made a fire outside and sat for a while, drinking beers and talking about nothing. Felt nice for a little while, but as the night deepened, that feeling of unease crept back in. I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the isolation messing with my head. But the feeling wouldn't go away. At some point, Mark went inside to grab another beer. I sat alone by the fire, staring out into the dark woods. That was when I heard it. A sound. Soft at first, like something moving through the underbrush. Then a snap, a branch breaking underfoot. My stomach dropped. "Mark!" I called out. No answer. The sound had come from the trees, not the cabin. I stood up, my heart pounding. I couldn't see anything past the firelight, just the black outlines of trees against the night sky. Then, another noise. Closer this time. Something was out there. I backed up toward the cabin, my mind racing. Could have been an animal. A deer, maybe, but something about the way it moved felt wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. Mark came back outside a moment later, oblivious to my panic. "Everything good?" he asked, popping the cap off his beer. I nodded, forcing myself to relax. "Yeah, just thought I heard something." He shrugged. "Probably a raccoon or something." I tried to believe him. I really did. But even after we went inside and locked the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the trees, watching. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me tense up. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind. Sometime after midnight, I heard something new. Footsteps. Slow, careful, right outside the window. I held my breath, staring at the ceiling. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a long pause, they moved away. I didn't dare look outside. I just lay there, heart hammering, waiting for morning. When the sun finally came up, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. I woke Mark, shaking him until he got up. "Look at this," I said, pointing to the prints. He frowned. "Could be old. They weren't there last night." He didn't have an answer for that. We checked around the cabin, but there was nothing else. No sign of anyone. No sign of where they had come from or where they had gone. Just those footprints circling the cabin. I wanted to leave. Mark said we were overreacting. Probably just some hiker passing through. I knew he was wrong. Hikers don't walk up to remote cabins in the middle of the night and stand outside the windows. The second night was worse. The sounds started again just after dark. The same slow movements in the trees. The same feeling of being watched. Mark still refused to admit anything was wrong. He sat by the fire like nothing was happening. I couldn't do it. I stayed inside, locked the door, and kept a knife within reach. Sometime in the night, I heard them again. The footsteps, closer this time. Then the sound of the doorknob rattling. I froze. My heart was in my throat. The door was locked. It had to be locked. The rattling stopped. Then silence. The longest silence I've ever known. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting for it to start again. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off. In the morning, I found something new. The shed door was open. We hadn't touched the shed since we got there, but now it hung open just slightly. I grabbed Mark and showed him. He didn't have an excuse this time. We both knew someone had been out there. Someone had been inside. That was it for me. I told him we had to leave. Now, we packed up in record time. Neither of us spoke much. We just wanted to get out of there. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. There was someone standing at the edge of the trees. A man, just standing there watching us go. I never saw his face. I never wanted to. We didn't talk about it after that. We just went home and pretended it never happened. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted. But I know one thing for sure. He wasn't just passing through. He was waiting. I rented the cabin because I needed quiet. That was the whole point. No phone, no internet, just a few weeks away from everything. Work had been draining, and I needed time to reset. The cabin was in northern Minnesota, about 15 miles from the nearest town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-story structure with a loft, a small kitchen, and a wood stove for heat. It had running water, but it came from a well, and electricity was from an old generator that the owner warned me might give me trouble. I didn't mind. I wanted trouble, the kind that forced me to think about something other than deadlines and emails. The drive up was uneventful. Long stretches of highway, then miles of dirt roads that seemed to go on forever. The forest was dense, trees pressing in on both sides, making it feel like I was driving through a tunnel. The air smelled different up there. Clean, sharp, like pine and damp earth. I stopped at the last gas station in town to pick up some extra supplies. Batteries, bottled water, a couple of lighters. The old man behind the counter gave me a look when I told him where I was headed. "Hope you're ready for the cold," he said. "Storms coming in a few days." I told him I'd be fine. I had plenty of firewood and food. Besides, I wasn't planning on going anywhere. He just nodded and rang up my things. The last few miles to the cabin were rough. The dirt road had deep ruts, and I had to take it slow. The trees thinned out as I got closer, revealing glimpses of the lake beyond. The cabin sat at the edge of the water, its porch facing west. It was exactly what I wanted. Isolated, quiet, untouched. The first couple of days were perfect. I spent my time reading, hiking, and chopping wood. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear. I felt better than I had in months. I had no distractions, no obligations, just time to be alone with my thoughts. The first sign that something was wrong came on the third night. I woke up around 2 a.m., feeling uneasy. At first, I thought it was just the silence. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Then I heard it, a soft creaking noise from outside. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, slow, like footsteps on the porch. I sat up, heart pounding. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and pointed it toward the window. The porch was empty. The trees beyond it stood still. I told myself it was just the cabin settling, or maybe an animal. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I searched the area around the cabin, looking for tracks. There was nothing, just undisturbed snow. I forced myself to shake it off. I was alone. No one knew I was here. It had to be my imagination. That night, the noises came again. Louder this time, more than just a creak. It sounded like someone moving just outside the window. I stayed in bed, barely breathing. I didn't want to look. The fear was different than anything I had felt before. It wasn't panic. It was a slow, creeping terror, the kind that seeps into your bones. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as the sun came up, I went outside. I wasn't imagining it. There were footprints in the snow, not mine. They circled the cabin, stopping at each window, pausing on the porch steps. I followed them, but they disappeared into the trees. I had no idea how long someone had been out there, watching me. I packed my things. I wasn't going to stay another night. I threw everything into my bag and headed for the truck. The keys were in the cup holder, just where I left them. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't even click. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, though I knew it wouldn't help. The battery cables were intact, no sign of tampering. But the battery was dead, completely drained. I hadn't left anything on. There was no reason for it to be dead. I tried my phone, knowing it was pointless. No service. I was stuck. I told myself I could walk back to town. 15 miles wasn't impossible. It would take a few hours, but I could make it before dark. I loaded up my backpack with water and food, grabbed my flashlight, and started down the road. I hadn't gone a mile before I saw them. Footprints, fresh ones, leading away from the cabin but veering off into the woods. Someone had been watching me, following me. I turned back. The idea of walking through miles of empty forest with someone out there, someone who had been circling my cabin at night, was worse than staying. At least in the cabin, I had walls, a door, a gun. I locked every window, every door. I kept the rifle within reach. I sat by the fire as the sun went down, my back against the wall, waiting. The night stretched on, long and silent. I listened to every sound, every shift of the wind, but nothing happened until just before dawn. A soft tap on the window. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. The tapping came again, slow, deliberate. I turned my head, just enough to see the window. A hand pressed against the glass, fingers splayed, pale against the darkness outside. I grabbed the rifle and stood up, heart slamming against my ribs. I took a step toward the window. The hand slid away. Footsteps crunched in the snow, moving toward the trees. I threw open the door, aiming the gun into the night. Nothing. The snow was disturbed, leading away from the cabin, disappearing into the forest. I didn't wait for morning. I took the rifle, my bag, and as much food as I could carry. I left the rest behind. I walked, fast, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The footprints beside me in the snow, parallel to mine, told me I wasn't alone. I walked until I reached the highway. A trucker stopped for me a couple hours later, taking one look at me and not asking questions. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't tell anyone. I never went back for my truck. Never contacted the owner. Never looked up news reports to see if anyone else had seen something out there. I didn't want to know. It was late October when I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. I wanted to get away from everything: work, people, the constant buzz of my phone. I had spent too many hours staring at a screen, too many nights listening to the distant hum of traffic outside my apartment window. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you could only find where the trees outnumbered the people 1,000 to 1. The cabin was old but well kept, sitting on a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The nearest town was about 40 miles away, just a scattering of buildings with a single gas station and a tiny grocery store. The road to the cabin was rough, barely more than a dirt path cutting through the trees. I had to take it slow in my truck, dodging potholes and fallen branches, the tires kicking up dust as I crept deeper into the woods. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, turning the sky into a deep shade of orange. The air was cold, sharper than I expected, and carried the damp scent of fallen leaves and earth. The cabin itself was simple: one floor, a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with an old wood stove. The owners had left a pile of chopped wood stacked neatly against the side of the cabin, along with a note on the table inside reminding me to keep the fire going at night. "Gets real cold up here," it said in shaky handwriting. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, a thick wool blanket wrapped around me, listening to the crackling wood. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, a slow, steady rustling that felt almost hypnotic. I hadn't felt this relaxed in years. I went to bed early, the cold biting at my nose despite the heavy quilt covering me. I woke up around 3 in the morning, heart pounding for no reason I could understand. The cabin was dead silent. No wind, no rustling branches, nothing. I listened for a long time, waiting for my heartbeat to slow. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling noise coming from outside. It wasn't an animal. I had grown up in the country, spent my childhood in the woods. I knew the sound of a deer moving through the brush, the sharp snap of a twig under a raccoon's weight. This was different. It was slow, deliberate. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, straining my ears. The sound moved around the cabin, a steady crunching of leaves. Then it stopped, just beneath my bedroom window. The cabin was old, the windows thin. If I moved, whatever was outside would hear me. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. After what felt like an hour, the noise moved away. I waited until I couldn't hear it anymore, then forced myself to get up and check the window. The glass was fogged from my breath, but I could see the outline of the trees, the clearing stretching into darkness. Nothing was there. I told myself it was an animal and went back to bed. The next morning, I stepped outside, the cold air waking me up instantly. I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was covered in damp leaves, but near my window, the leaves had been disturbed, pushed aside to reveal dark, damp earth beneath. No clear footprints, but something had been there, watching. I shook it off. I was being paranoid. I spent the day hiking, exploring the woods, trying to clear my head. When I got back to the cabin, I made a fire, cooked a simple meal, and tried to relax. That night, I locked the door and checked the windows twice before going to bed. I woke up again, this time to a sound much closer. A faint creaking like wood bending under weight. The porch. My stomach clenched. Someone was on the porch. I sat up slowly, my pulse thudding in my ears. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting weak, flickering light across the room. Then came a soft knock. Not loud, not urgent, just a single, deliberate tap against the wooden door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Another knock, then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my body frozen. Eventually, the sky outside began to lighten. I waited until full daylight before getting up, my body stiff from tension. When I opened the door, my throat went dry. There were marks on the porch. Not footprints exactly, just long, uneven streaks, as if something had been dragged. The wood was scratched, deep grooves cutting into the planks. I packed my things in under 10 minutes. As I threw my bag into the truck, I noticed something in the dirt near the trees. A single handprint pressed deep into the mud, larger than mine, fingers too long, too thin. I never looked back. I was never one for solo trips, but I had reached a point in life where I needed some time alone. Work had drained me. My personal life was a mess, and I couldn't remember the last time I felt at peace. So, when I found a listing for a secluded cabin deep in the forests of Michigan, I booked it without a second thought. A week away from everything sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin was old but well-maintained, nestled in the heart of a dense pine forest. The nearest town was about an hour's drive away, and I had stocked up on groceries before heading out. As I arrived, I took in my surroundings. Just towering trees, the smell of damp earth, and complete silence except for the occasional rustling of branches. The cabin itself was small, built from aged wood that had turned a deep brown over the years. It had one bedroom, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a living space with a fireplace. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and barely any cell reception. That was fine. I wanted the isolation. My first night was uneventful. I made dinner, read for a bit by the dim light of a lantern, and went to bed early. The bed was old and creaky, but I was too exhausted to care. The silence was thick, the kind that made you hyper-aware of every small noise. I told myself it was just the sounds of nature and drifted off to sleep. The second night, I started feeling uneasy. It was nothing specific, just a sense of something being off. Maybe it was the way the trees outside seemed too still, or how the wind would suddenly stop and leave a heavy silence behind. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to my mind, adjusting to the quiet after years of city noise. By the third night, the feeling had intensified. I kept waking up to sounds outside, twigs snapping, something rustling through the leaves. Probably an animal, I told myself. Still, I made sure the doors were locked and that nothing was left outside to attract wildlife. On the fourth night, I woke up to something different. Not the rustling of an animal, but something heavier. Something moving slowly just beyond the cabin walls. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I sat up in bed, barely breathing, waiting for whatever it was to move away. But it didn't. It stopped just outside my bedroom window. I didn't move. I barely blinked. The window was covered with an old curtain, but I could feel something watching me. My body screamed at me to turn on a light, to make some noise, to do anything, but I couldn't. I just sat there, heart hammering, staring at the window as if I could will whatever was out there to leave. And then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps started again, moving slowly, deliberately, before fading into the distance. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I forced myself outside. I needed to see if I had imagined it. The ground outside the window was covered in pine needles, but there were marks, disturbed patches of earth where something had stood. I couldn't make out any clear footprints, but something had been there. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in me told me to pack up and drive away. But I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I had come here for solitude, and I wasn't going to run because of a few noises. That night, I locked every door and window, made sure my flashlight was within reach, and even kept a knife by my bed. I felt foolish, but I didn't care. Sometime past midnight, the noises started again. The slow footsteps, moving in circles around the cabin. My breath hitched as they stopped outside the door. There was no knock, no attempt to open it. Just waiting, listening. Then, footsteps moved toward the window again. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached, and with a deep breath, I yanked the curtain aside and shined the light outside. Nothing. The trees stood still. The forest was empty, but the footsteps had been real. I knew they had. I didn't sleep at all that night. At first light, I packed up my things, loaded my car, and sped out of there without looking back. As I drove back to civilization, my phone finally picked up a signal, and messages started flooding in. I barely glanced at them. I was too busy trying to calm my nerves. A week later, I got an email from the owner of the cabin, checking in on my stay. I debated whether to mention what happened, but decided against it. Instead, I asked something simple. Has anyone else ever mentioned hearing footsteps at night? The reply came quickly. No, never. You were the first person to stay there in over 10 years. I never responded. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I felt like I owed him something. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't as much of a coward as I felt. But when Mark asked me to help him clear out his uncle's old hunting cabin up north, I didn't hesitate to say yes. Mark's uncle had died the previous winter, slipped on some ice, cracked his head on a rock, and froze to death. The body wasn't found until the spring thaw, when some hikers noticed the smell. Mark told me all of this while we drove up there, the words rolling out of his mouth casually, like he was talking about a grocery list. The drive took nearly 5 hours, the last 2 on roads that were barely more than dirt paths winding through dense pine trees. There was no cell service, no gas stations, no signs of life at all. Just the road, the trees, and the occasional rusted-out mailbox, long abandoned. The cabin itself was small, just one room with a loft above it. It smelled like damp wood and old sweat. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by the faint breeze coming through a crack in one of the windows. Mark told me his uncle had been a loner, living out here most of the year, only coming into town when he absolutely had to. Looking around, I could believe it. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Under the dust and mildew, there was something else, something sharp and sour. I tried not to think about it. The place had been abandoned for almost a year. It was bound to stink. Still, my stomach tightened as I stepped inside. Mark got to work immediately, pulling old blankets off the bed, emptying cabinets filled with canned food long past its expiration date. I took the outside. There was a small woodshed out back, half collapsed under the weight of last winter's snow. Inside, I found stacks of firewood, an old rusted axe, and a few more things that made my stomach twist. A pile of animal bones in the corner, scattered haphazardly like someone had just dumped them there. Next to them, a single boot, torn at the top, with what looked like dried blood around the edges. I told myself it was nothing. Probably some animal had dragged it in here. Maybe his uncle had killed something and never cleaned up after himself. But when I looked at the ground, I noticed something else. Drag marks, faint but clear, leading from the shed to the tree line. I went back inside and told Mark what I found. He barely looked up from where he was stuffing old blankets into a trash bag. "Yeah, my uncle hunted a lot," he said. "Kept the skins, left the rest. Probably coyotes got to it. But something about it felt wrong. The way the bones were piled, the drag marks leading into the woods. I decided not to push it. The sooner we finished, the sooner we could leave. We worked in silence for a few more hours. The whole time, I felt uneasy, like someone was watching us. Every now and then, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow in the trees, a flicker of motion near the shed. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. As the sun set, Mark decided to start a fire. He said we'd spend the night and head back in the morning. I didn't like the idea, but I wasn't about to drive back alone. So we sat by the fire, eating cold beans from a can, barely talking. The woods around us were silent. No wind, no birds, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the old cabin behind us. Then we heard it, a low, dragging sound coming from the woods, slow, deliberate, like something heavy being pulled through the underbrush. I turned to Mark. He was staring into the trees, his face pale in the firelight. "Probably a deer," he muttered, but his voice was tight. I could tell he didn't believe it. The sound came again, closer this time. My hands clenched into fists. I wanted to run, to grab my keys and get the hell out of there. But I didn't move. Couldn't. Then silence. For what felt like an eternity, we just sat there, listening. Then Mark stood up. "I'm gonna check it out." I grabbed his arm. "Are you insane?" He shook me off. "It's probably nothing. Maybe a bear. I just want to see." Before I could stop him, he grabbed the flashlight and walked into the trees. The beam of light bounced as he moved, illuminating the trunks in flashes of white. I listened as his footsteps crunched against the leaves, growing fainter, until they stopped altogether. Silence again. Then, a sharp, strangled yell. I bolted to my feet. "Mark!" No answer. Then the sound came back. The dragging. Closer now. Too close. I turned and ran for the cabin. slamming the door behind me, bolting it shut. My breath came in ragged gasps. I listened, heart pounding. Something was out there, something that had taken Mark. The dragging sound stopped just outside the door. I pressed my back against the wood, trying to stay silent. My fingers found the rusted axe I'd brought in from the shed, my knuckles white around the handle. Then, a single, slow knock. I clenched my jaw, gripping the axe tighter. Another knock, then another, and then the door creaked open. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, a shape in the doorway, the sound of my own breathing, the weight of the axe in my hands as I swung. Then darkness. When I woke up, it was morning. The door was open, hanging off one hinge. Mark was gone. His flashlight lay on the ground outside. The lens cracked. There was no blood, no footprints, just the drag marks leading away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees. I never saw Mark again. The police searched for weeks but found nothing. No body, no tracks, no sign he had ever been there at all. They told me he probably got lost, wandered off into the woods, and froze to death. But I know better. I know something took him, and I know that whatever it was, it's still out there. I had been looking for a quiet place to stay for a while. Life had been wearing me down, and I needed to get away from the noise, the people, and the endless routine that made each day blur into the next. So, when I found a listing for an old cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana, it seemed perfect. The owner claimed it had been built in the early 1900s and had no modern luxuries. No running water, no electricity, just a wood-burning stove and a hand-pumped well out back. It sounded like exactly what I needed. The drive out was long. I left the main highway sometime in the early afternoon and followed a narrow, cracked road through miles of dense pine forest. The deeper I went, the more I realized just how isolated the place was. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and a heavy silence had settled over everything. There were no power lines, no signs of other people, just the dark woods pressing in on all sides. I parked my truck in front and stepped out. The cabin looked just like the pictures. A small, single-story structure with a steeply pitched roof and a sagging front porch. The wood was gray and weathered, and the windows were small and dark, like lifeless eyes. I grabbed my bags and went inside, bracing myself for dust and cobwebs, but the interior was surprisingly clean. There was a table and a few chairs, a narrow bed pushed against one wall, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The air smelled like old wood and damp earth. I set my bags down and lit a few candles. As the light flickered across the walls, I felt an odd sense of unease. Maybe it was just the silence or the fact that I hadn't seen another person for hours, but something about the place felt off. I shook it off and went to check the well out back. The pump worked, though the water had a metallic taste to it. I made a mental note to boil it before drinking. That first night was restless. I wasn't scared exactly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time I started to drift off, some small noise would pull me back. Branches shifting in the wind, the creak of old wood settling. I told myself it was just the cabin adjusting to the cold night air, but deep down I wasn't convinced. The next few days were uneventful. I spent my time chopping wood, fishing in a nearby stream, and reading by candlelight. It was exactly the kind of solitude I had been looking for. But at night, the unease crept back in. I kept waking up to the sound of something moving outside. Not the wind, not the usual nighttime noises of the forest. Something deliberate. Footsteps, slow and measured, circling the cabin. One night, I worked up the nerve to check. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The woods were still, the trees looming in the darkness like silent sentinels. I scanned the area, but there was nothing. No movement, no signs of anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching. On the fifth night, things escalated. I had just started to drift off when a loud thud shook the cabin. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I lay there, heart pounding. Then another thud, closer this time. It sounded like something heavy hitting the wall just outside my window. I grabbed the hunting knife I kept by the bed and stood up, listening. Silence. I waited, my breath shallow. Then, just as I was about to sit back down, I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. My blood turned to ice. Someone or something was out there. The steps paused right outside the door. I gripped the knife tighter, every muscle in my body tensed. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps retreated, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had convinced myself it had been an animal. A bear, maybe, or a coyote scavenging for food. But when I stepped outside, I found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints, leading from the tree line to my porch and back again. I packed my bags right then and there. I didn't care how much I had paid for the week. Didn't care if I was overreacting. I wasn't about to wait around to see who or what had been out there. I threw everything into my truck and started the engine. As I pulled away, I took one last look at the cabin in my rearview mirror. The door was still closed, the porch empty. But deep in the woods, just beyond the tree line, I thought I saw movement. A dark shape, standing perfectly still, watching me leave. I pressed the gas pedal a little harder and didn't look back. I never told anyone what happened out there. What would I even say? That I got scared of some footprints? That I ran because I thought I saw someone standing in the trees? It sounded ridiculous, but I know what I felt. I know what I heard, and I know that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have made it out at all. The road stretched ahead of me, a narrow dirt path cutting through miles of dense forest. The tires of my truck crunched over gravel, the sound oddly muffled by the towering trees surrounding me on all sides. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. I checked my phone, no signal. Not surprising. I hadn't had reception for the last 30 minutes. I was headed to a cabin deep in the mountains of Montana. It was early November, the air cold enough that frost clung to the edges of my windshield when I left town that morning. A guy I worked with, Mark, had told me about this place. He'd gone up a few times and swore it was the best spot to get away from everything. No cell service, no noise, just pure isolation. That was exactly what I needed. Life had been exhausting, and I wanted to disappear for a bit. The cabin belonged to Mark's uncle, who apparently didn't use it much. I had gotten permission to stay for the week as long as I left it the way I found it. No problem. I liked being alone, and I wasn't the type to trash a place. Mark had given me directions since GPS wouldn't work out here. I had written them down, but as I glanced at the note on my passenger seat, something felt off. I had followed everything correctly, but I should have been there by now. Maybe I had underestimated the drive. I pressed forward. As I drove deeper, the road narrowed. It was barely more than a trail now, the edges lined with fallen leaves. The trees grew denser, their bare branches tangling above, filtering out the last bit of sunlight. The thought hit me suddenly. I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. No houses, no signs of people. Just me, my truck, and the endless trees. The road took a sharp curve, and then I saw it. The cabin. It sat in a small clearing, a one-story wooden structure with a slanted roof. It looked old but sturdy. A stone chimney rose from one side, and a wooden porch wrapped around the front. A pile of firewood was stacked neatly near the door. Mark had said his uncle had a neighbor who sometimes stopped by to check on the place. Maybe he had been here recently. I pulled the truck close to the cabin and shut off the engine. The silence was immediate and overwhelming. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, nothing. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of dry leaves. I climbed out and stretched, my joints aching from the long drive. The cabin door was unlocked, just as Mark had said it would be. Inside, it was exactly what I expected, rustic, simple, but comfortable. A fireplace dominated one wall, with a few chairs and a small couch positioned around it. The kitchen was basic, with an old gas stove and a sink with a hand pump for water. A single bedroom with a cot and a worn-out mattress. Everything smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. I set my bag down and checked the cabinets. There were a few canned goods, but I had brought my own supplies. I wasn't planning on hunting or fishing, just existing here for a few days. I started a fire in the fireplace, the warmth spreading quickly through the small space. As the flames crackled, I sat down in one of the chairs and let out a deep breath. Felt good to be alone. That first night, I slept deeply, the kind of sleep I hadn't had in months. No alarms, no city noise, just pure darkness and quiet. I woke up with the sun streaming through the small windows, feeling rested. I spent the morning exploring the area. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched for miles, the trees thick and unyielding. A small stream ran nearby, its water clear and cold. I followed it for a while, listening to the birds and the distant creaking of trees in the wind. The air smelled fresh, clean. It was exactly what I had needed, but by the second night, something felt different. It started with small things. The feeling that the woods were too quiet, that the usual sounds of animals moving through the underbrush had stopped. I told myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't used to this kind of isolation. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light across the room. I listened, my heart beat heavy in my chest, and then I heard it, something moving outside. Not an animal. The footsteps were too slow, deliberate. I stayed still, barely breathing. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other. I told myself it was my imagination. Maybe a deer, maybe a trick of the wind. Then I heard the creak of the porch steps. I sat up slowly, straining to hear. The steps creaked again. My breath caught in my throat. There was someone outside. I reached for the flashlight next to my cot and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the front window. I moved quietly, inching toward the door. My truck keys were on the table, but I wasn't about to rush outside without knowing what was out there. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I stood there, flashlight in hand, waiting. 5 minutes, 10, nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came, and everything seemed normal again. No footprints, no signs of anything. I told myself I had imagined it. The isolation was getting to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I made sure the fire stayed going. I kept the flashlight and my knife close. I listened, and then, sometime after midnight, the sound came back. The slow, deliberate footsteps, moving around the cabin. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, yanked open the door, and ran to my truck. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights flooded the clearing. Nothing, just trees, just silence. I sat there for a long time, my breath coming in short gasps. Then, without turning off the engine, I threw the truck into reverse, backed out onto the narrow road, and started driving. I didn't stop, not until I was miles away, back on a main road with cell service. I called Mark the next day, told him what had happened. He went up there a week later and found the cabin exactly as I had left it. Except for one thing, the firewood I had stacked was gone, replaced with a fresh pile. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. I never went back. It was late October when I drove up to the cabin. I had rented it for a week, hoping to get some peace and quiet away from the city. The listing said it was an off-grid experience nestled deep in the mountains of Montana, with no electricity, no running water, and only a wood stove for heat. That was fine with me. I wanted silence. I wanted isolation. The drive up was rough. The road was just a single dirt path winding through thick trees. My truck bounced over rocks and deep ruts, my headlights barely cutting through the early evening fog. I hadn't seen another vehicle for nearly an hour. That was expected, though. The cabin was miles from the nearest town. No cell service, no neighbors. Just me, the trees, and the cold autumn wind. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was nearly dark. The place looked older than I expected. Logs blackened with age, the roof sagging just slightly. A single wooden step creaked under my weight as I walked to the front door. The key was right where the owner said it would be, hidden under a loose stone beside the door. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and dust. The furniture was basic, just a wooden table, 2 chairs, a sagging couch, and a small cot pushed up against the far wall. A single bookshelf held a few old paperbacks, their covers curled from age. There was a small stove in the corner, already stocked with a pile of firewood. The only light came from the few candles left on the table. I set my bag down, took off my jacket, and went outside to grab more firewood. The air had a sharp chill to it, and I could hear the rustling of branches as the wind moved through the trees. No birds, no animals, just the sound of the wind. I didn't think much of it at the time. That first night was uneventful. I lit a fire, heated up a can of soup, and read one of the old books. The silence was thick, no cars passing by, no distant hum of electricity, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I fell asleep easily. The next morning I woke early. The air was freezing, my breath visible in the dim light filtering through the cabin's small window. I got up, added more wood to the stove, and stepped outside. The forest was still. The ground was covered in a thin layer of frost, the trees standing motionless. I decided to go for a walk. There was supposed to be a lake about a mile away, according to the old hand-drawn map left on the table. I took my time, following a narrow trail through the trees. The deeper I went, the heavier the silence became. No crunch of leaves from scurrying animals, no distant bird calls, just my own footsteps. When I reached the lake, I stopped. The water was still, reflecting the overcast sky. Something about it made me uneasy. Couldn't place why. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was how the trees on the other side seemed darker, almost blending together into a single mass. I sat on a fallen log for a while, listening. Nothing, just the occasional gust of wind rippling the surface of the lake. That's when I noticed it. Footprints, not mine. They led from the treeline to the water's edge, then stopped. The ground was damp, and the prints were fresh. Someone had been here, standing right where I was now. But there were no footprints leading away. I stared at them for a long time, my pulse quickening. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had covered the rest of the tracks. I shook off the unease and made my way back to the cabin. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every now and then, I'd get the strange sense that I was being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation messing with my head. That night, I locked the cabin door. I hadn't bothered the night before, but now it felt necessary. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound outside, a single, deliberate crunch of leaves. I held my breath, listening. Another step, closer. The cabin had no curtains. I didn't want to look, but I forced myself to. Moving slowly, I turned my head toward the window. Nothing, just darkness. Then, another step, right outside the door. I sat up, heart hammering. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the dark, landing on the door. The old wooden latch was still in place. I waited. Minutes passed. The only sound was my own breathing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. I lay back down, pulling the blanket up to my chin. Took a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I checked outside. No tracks. No sign that anything had been there. I told myself I imagined it. The third night was worse. I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the cabin wall. Slow, deliberate, like fingernails on wood. I didn't move. I just listened. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It stopped. Silence stretched on. Then, a single knock on the door. Not a loud one, just a light tap. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the floor. Another knock. I grabbed the knife from my bag and held it tight. Who would be out here? Who would come to an isolated cabin in the middle of the night? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there, knife in hand, staring at the door. When the first light of dawn crept in, I packed my things. I didn't bother with breakfast. I threw my bag in the truck and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced back at the cabin. That's when I saw it. Carved into the wood, just beside the door, a single word: leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I never told anyone what happened. I don't know if it was some drifter, some lunatic living out in those woods. I don't know if they were watching me from the trees as I drove away. But I do know one thing: I'll never go back there again. It was my brother's idea. James had been talking about it for years, how we needed to take a break from our jobs, from the city, and just go somewhere quiet. The cabin belonged to an old family friend, and when he passed away, it sat empty for a long time. James had gotten permission from the late owner's son to use it whenever we wanted. He had been up there once before and swore it was the perfect getaway. No cell service, no traffic, no distractions. Just the woods, the lake, and silence. I had my doubts. Something about the idea of being completely cut off never sat right with me. But James was relentless, and eventually I gave in. It was late October, and the air had just started turning sharp. The trees were in their last stages of color before shedding everything for winter. It seemed like a good time to go. The drive was long. We left early in the morning, but the roads winding through the mountains took longer than I expected. The farther we got from civilization, the more uneasy I felt. There was something about the forest that felt too dense, too closed in. The road leading up to the cabin was narrow and covered in fallen leaves, making it hard to tell where the edges were. I drove carefully, gripping the wheel tightly as James sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through an old map since there was no GPS out here. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. It sat near the edge of a lake, with a wraparound porch and a chimney that hadn't been used in years. It had that old wood smell, dusty but familiar. Inside, there were only the bare essentials: a few chairs, a table, an old gas stove, and 2 cots in the back room. No electricity, just oil lamps and a wood-burning stove for heat. James thought it was charming. I thought it was unsettling. The first day was uneventful. We unpacked, gathered some firewood, and settled in. James tried fishing off the dock, but the water was too cold, and nothing was biting. By nightfall, we were sitting by the fireplace, listening to the wind outside. It was peaceful, I had to admit. The fire crackled, and the lake was so still it looked like glass under the moonlight. Maybe James was right. Maybe this was exactly what we needed. But then, something changed. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling off. Not scared, not yet, just off. The kind of feeling you get when you wake up in a place that isn't your own. But it was more than that. I listened to James breathing in the cot next to mine. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows on the wooden walls. And then I heard it, something outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer moving through the trees. But the sound was too deliberate. It was slow, careful. Footsteps, not crunching through the underbrush, but stepping lightly on the porch. I held my breath. It stopped. For a long time, there was nothing, just silence and the distant rustling of leaves. I convinced myself I imagined it, that it was just the wind shifting the old boards. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I almost didn't mention it to James, but something was nagging at me. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked as we ate breakfast. James shook his head. "Just the wind." I tried to let it go, but something didn't sit right. That day, we explored the woods, hiked a little, but the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I told myself I was just being paranoid. The isolation was getting to me, but that night it happened again. This time, I was awake when I heard it. Slow, deliberate steps on the porch. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. James was asleep, breathing evenly. I didn't want to wake him if it was nothing. I grabbed the flashlight next to my cot and shined it toward the window. Nothing. The steps stopped again, just like the night before. I listened for what felt like forever, but there was nothing else. Just that thick, suffocating silence. Eventually, I lay back down, forcing myself to sleep. Morning came, and I stepped outside, searching for tracks. But the ground was dry, covered in fallen leaves, and I couldn't find anything. James was already up, chopping wood, acting like everything was normal. I almost told him again, but I didn't want to sound crazy. That was my mistake. By the third night, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The footsteps were back, but this time they didn't stop. They moved along the porch, slow and steady. Then they descended the steps. I held my breath as I listened to them move around the cabin. A full circle. They weren't in a hurry. Whoever it was knew we were inside, and they wanted us to know they were out there. I reached for the hunting knife I had brought, gripping it tight. The footsteps stopped on the far side of the cabin, near the back window. I turned my head slowly, barely breathing. Through the moonlight, I could just make out a shadow standing by the tree line. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was watching us. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stared, waiting for it to move. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, but eventually, my body forced me to blink, and when I opened my eyes, the shadow was gone. The next morning, I told James everything. He laughed it off at first, but when he saw how serious I was, his expression changed. We agreed to leave that day. We packed up fast, barely speaking. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching us. But the woods were still. We made it to the car without incident, but as we drove away, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, just before the cabin faded from view. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they wanted, but I know one thing for certain. We were never alone out there. I had never been one to believe in the idea that places held energy. Bad things happened everywhere, cities, highways, houses. But some places, I think, keep a memory of it in a way that makes the air feel heavier, makes your skin prickle before you even realize something's off. That's what I felt when I stepped onto the porch of the old cabin. I was renting it for a week in the fall of 2019. Just me, my truck, and the quiet. I needed it. Work had been draining, and I was tired of city noise, tired of the way my apartment walls seemed to press in on me after long shifts. A cabin out in the woods of northern Michigan sounded perfect. No phone service, no internet, just trees, a lake, and silence. The cabin was small, just one story with a loft. The wood was old but sturdy, the kind that turned gray over decades but didn't rot. A single, creaky rocking chair sat on the porch, facing the trees that stretched out endlessly in every direction. When I stepped inside, the smell of damp wood and dust settled into my nose. It had been empty for a while. The first night, nothing happened. I made a fire in the wood stove, cooked some canned soup, and read by lantern light. It was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, but I figured I just needed to get used to it. I woke up around 2 a.m., feeling like something had yanked me out of sleep. I listened. Nothing. Just the wind pushing against the trees, the faint creak of the cabin settling. I turned over, pulled the blankets up, and forced myself back to sleep. The second day, I explored the woods. There was a narrow path leading down to the lake, barely visible beneath a thick layer of fallen leaves. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that tightened your skin. The lake was beautiful, still, dark, and lined with jagged rocks. No boats, no docks, just water stretching out under the gray sky. That night, I felt it again, that strange, uneasy feeling. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like the sense that something was just slightly wrong. I locked the doors, even though I was miles from anyone, and set my hatchet by the bed, just in case. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound felt too sharp, too close. The wind outside had died down, but the trees still creaked like someone was shifting their weight just out of sight. Sometime in the night, I heard a sound, faint but deliberate. A soft scraping against the side of the cabin, slow, steady, like fingernails dragging along wood. I sat up, every nerve in my body on edge. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was a branch, maybe an animal, but I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. There were no branches close enough to scrape the walls, no tracks in the dirt. The thought unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I almost packed up and left that day, but I convinced myself I was overreacting. City life had made me soft. I needed to relax. It was just a cabin, just the woods, just my own mind playing tricks on me. That night, the noise came back, louder this time, a dragging sound, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I gripped my hatchet and forced myself to wait it out. My pulse hammered in my throat. It was too steady, too deliberate. An animal wouldn't move like that. Then silence. I barely slept, but when the sun rose, the woods were calm, untouched. I forced myself to step outside. I needed to prove to myself there was nothing there. But there were tracks. Not animal tracks, not boot prints, just long, uneven grooves in the dirt, trailing along the side of the cabin where I had heard the sound. They started at the back of the cabin and disappeared into the trees. No footprints, no sign of what made them. I packed my bags. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. Something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my gut, that instinctive warning that something wasn't safe. I tossed my gear in the truck and turned the key. The engine didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Battery was fine. Plenty of gas. But the engine wouldn't turn over. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. I had no phone signal. No one knew exactly where I was. It was a 2-hour hike to the nearest road, and even then, I wasn't sure how often cars passed through. I had planned to be alone out here. That was the whole point. Now, it didn't feel like such a good idea. I spent the day checking the truck, trying to find what was wrong. Nothing looked out of place. The wires were fine. The battery was fine. It made no sense. As the sun dipped below the trees, a heavy dread settled over me. I didn't want to go back inside. I didn't want to be here another night. I built a fire outside and sat with my back against the truck, hatchet in hand. The night was too quiet. No wind, no insects, no movement, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then the sound came again, that slow, dragging scrape moving around the cabin. I gripped the hatchet so tight my knuckles ached. My breathing was too loud, too fast. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the dark silhouette of the cabin. The sound stopped. Silence stretched on. Then the truck engine roared to life. I didn't question it. I didn't look back. I jumped in, slammed the door, and peeled out of there so fast gravel sprayed against the trees. I didn't stop driving. Not when I hit the main road. Not when I passed the first gas station in nearly an hour. I kept going until I reached a town, a motel with flickering neon lights. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never went back for my things. Never told anyone the full story. I don't know what was out there, what was dragging itself along the walls of that cabin. But I know one thing: some places aren't meant to be visited. Some places remember, and some places don't want you to leave. I was never the type to believe in bad luck, but after what happened in that cabin, I don't know what else to call it. It happened in the fall of 2019. I was 29 then, working a mind-numbing office job in Chicago, and badly in need of a break. So when my old friend Mark suggested a solo getaway to his family's remote cabin in northern Wisconsin, I jumped at the chance. I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but the idea of unplugging, hiking, and clearing my head sounded perfect. The drive took me nearly 6 hours. The last 30 miles were on narrow, winding roads through dense woods, the kind where trees pressed in so tightly they nearly blocked out the sky. I lost cell service about halfway in. That was expected, but it still made me uneasy. I arrived just before sunset. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a wraparound porch and a tin roof that rattled when the wind picked up. It sat at the edge of a deep forest, overlooking a narrow, still lake. It was exactly the kind of place you'd picture in an old camping brochure. Quiet, isolated, peaceful. I let myself in with the spare key Mark had left under a loose porch plank. Inside, The cabin smelled of dust and old wood. The walls were lined with bookshelves and mounted deer heads, and a stone fireplace took up most of one wall. There was no Wi-Fi, no television, just a battery-powered radio and a single landline phone that Mark warned me only worked when it felt like it. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, read for a bit by lantern light, and went to bed early. I slept deeply, the silence of the woods pressing down like a heavy blanket. The next morning, I decided to hike. There was an old logging trail that led deeper into the woods, and I followed it for hours. The air was crisp, the trees nearly bare. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves. It was exactly what I'd needed. Around midday, I stopped to rest on a fallen tree. That's when I noticed something odd. A narrow, almost overgrown path leading off the main trail. It didn't look like a proper trail, more like something people had once used and forgotten about. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it. I stepped off the trail and followed it. The deeper I went, the quieter the woods became. I don't mean peaceful quiet, I mean dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just an eerie stillness. The path eventually led to a small clearing where I found something that made my stomach drop. A fire pit, long cold, surrounded by half-buried beer cans and an old, rusted-out folding chair. It looked like people had camped there years ago, but something about it felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it gave me a bad feeling. I turned back, suddenly uneasy, and retraced my steps to the cabin. The whole way back, I had the overwhelming sense that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd stop and glance over my shoulder, but there was never anything there, just trees stretching on forever. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I stepped onto the porch to get some air, I noticed something strange. The leaves near the steps, leaves that had been scattered randomly when I arrived, were disturbed, like someone had walked through them. The prints were faint, almost indistinguishable, but they were there, and they weren't mine. I told myself it could have been anything, an animal, the wind, but I couldn't convince myself to relax. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows and forced myself to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound, a slow, deliberate creaking. The porch, my heart pounded. The cabin was old, and the woods settled at night, but this wasn't settling. This was movement. I lay frozen, barely breathing. The creaking continued, slow, steady. Someone was out there. I slid out of bed as quietly as possible and grabbed the only weapon I had, a fire poker from the hearth. I moved to the window, careful not to make a sound. The porch was empty, but something didn't feel right. Then I saw it. The door handle. It was moving. Someone was trying to get in. My stomach lurched. I gripped the poker tighter, heart hammering in my chest. The handle jiggled again, harder this time. Then silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own breathing. Eventually, I convinced myself whoever it was had gone. I stayed awake until dawn, fire poker in hand, waiting for the first sign of daylight. When the sun finally came up, I stepped onto the porch. My breath caught. The leaves were disturbed again, but this time, there were footprints, bare footprints, leading from the woods to my door. I packed my things in record time. I didn't care how beautiful or peaceful the cabin was supposed to be. I wasn't staying another night. I locked up and started my truck, hands shaking. The drive back felt like a race, like I was being chased even though I never saw anyone. By the time I reached cell service, I had dozens of missed calls from Mark. I called him back and told him what happened. He was quiet for a long time, then sighed. "Yeah," he finally said. "That's why my family stopped going up there." He never elaborated, and I never asked. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't know if they were just messing with me, or if they had something worse in mind. But I do know one thing. I will never, ever go back to that cabin. I don't know how to explain what happened to me in that cabin. It still doesn't make sense, and I don't think it ever will. I've gone over every possible explanation, rational ones, scientific ones, psychological ones, but nothing fits quite right. I've thought about keeping it to myself, letting it fade into the back of my mind like a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream, and I can't ignore it anymore. It happened in the winter of 2018. I was 29 at the time, just looking for a quiet place to escape. Life had been pressing down on me in ways I wasn't prepared for, and I needed space to clear my head. That's how I ended up renting a small cabin deep in the forests of northern Michigan. It wasn't completely off the grid. The place had electricity, running water, and a propane heating system, but it was isolated. No neighbors, no cell service, just trees and snow for miles in every direction. The listing online had made it look charming, a perfect getaway spot. The pictures showed a cozy one-bedroom cabin, freshly renovated, with a wood-burning stove and a wraparound porch. It had good reviews too, mostly from people who stayed in the summer and raved about the nearby hiking trails. I booked it for a full week, packed my truck with everything I'd need, and made the 6-hour drive from my apartment in Grand Rapids. The drive out there was uneventful, just long and quiet. As I got closer, the roads turned from pavement to packed dirt, and eventually to snow-covered trails that hadn't seen a plow in days. I had to slow down to a crawl, my truck's tires struggling for traction as I wound my way deeper into the woods. When I finally reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how empty everything felt. The trees were thick and silent, heavy with fresh snow, and the sky was a dull gray that made the whole world seem flat. There were no tracks in the snow, no sign that anyone had been there in a long time. That was fine with me. I wanted solitude. The cabin itself was exactly like the pictures. Maybe a little more worn, but nothing concerning. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by tall pines. A stone chimney poked up from the roof, and the porch wrapped around 3 sides, just like the listing said. I parked my truck near the front steps, grabbed my bags, and unlocked the door. Inside, the air was stale, like no one had been inside for months. I turned on the lights, and they flickered before settling into a steady glow. The main room was small but comfortable, wood-paneled walls, a couch facing the stove, a tiny kitchenette in the corner. A single door led to the bedroom, and a narrow hallway took me to the bathroom and a storage closet. The first few hours were uneventful. I unpacked my stuff, set up my laptop on the kitchen table, even though I knew I wouldn't have Wi-Fi, and made myself a cup of coffee. The silence was thick, pressing against my ears like cotton. I tried to embrace it, to let it be the peace I was looking for. That night, I built a fire in the stove, ate a quick dinner, and went to bed early. I hadn't realized how tired I was until I lay down. The mattress was firm, the blankets heavy, and I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It was subtle, just on the edge of my hearing, something faint and rhythmic. I stayed still for a moment, listening. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was something else. A soft, deliberate tapping like fingertips drumming against wood. I sat up, my breath fogging in the cold air. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. I listened harder, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from outside. I slipped out of bed and moved to the window, pressing my forehead against the cold glass. The porch was empty. The trees stood still in the moonlight, their branches heavy with snow. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. After a minute, I shook my head and climbed back into bed. It was probably just ice shifting on the roof, or a branch tapping against the side of the cabin. I was alone out here. There was nothing to be afraid of. The next few days passed without incident. I spent my time reading, writing, and taking short walks through the woods. The air was crisp, the snow thick and undisturbed except for my footprints. At night, I kept the fire going and bundled up under the covers. I told myself I was relaxing, that this was exactly what I needed, but the tapping came back. Always late at night, always faint and rhythmic. Some nights it sounded closer, like it was coming from the porch. Other nights it was further away, drifting in from the trees. I told myself it was nothing, but it started getting to me. I found myself waking up several times a night, heart pounding, straining to hear through the silence. On the fifth night, I finally decided to check. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my boots, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit me like a slap, sharp and biting. My breath curled in front of me as I swept the light across the trees. Nothing. The snow was untouched, smooth as glass. No footprints, no signs of movement. I stood there for a long time, shivering, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing it. And then I saw them, far at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Two dark shapes, standing still. My stomach dropped. They weren't animals. They were tall, human-shaped, unmoving. I blinked and they were gone. I don't remember going back inside. I don't remember locking the door. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, the fire burning high. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't care that I had 2 nights left on my reservation. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. Something was out there, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it wanted. I didn't see anything in the rearview mirror as I drove away. No figures, no movement, just the empty forest, silent and cold. I never told anyone about it. What would I even say? That I got scared and ran? That I imagined something in the woods? Maybe that's all it was. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I still dream about that cabin. And when I do, the tapping always comes back. It was the summer of 2017 when my uncle offered me his cabin for a week. He had bought the place about 10 years earlier as a hunting retreat, but he rarely used it anymore. It's peaceful, he told me. Middle of nowhere, no neighbors, no noise. At the time, that sounded perfect. I had been dealing with some stress, and the thought of disconnecting from the world, even for a few days, seemed like the right move. The drive was long. Once I passed through the last small town, the roads turned to dirt, and the trees got thicker. The cabin sat deep in the woods, miles from any other house. No power lines, no streetlights, just trees and the sound of my tires crunching gravel. I remember rolling down my window and taking in the smell of pine and damp earth. It was the kind of place where time slowed down. The cabin itself was old but solid. A single-story structure with a small porch and a pitched roof. My uncle kept it in good shape, but it had that heavy, worn-in feeling, like it had seen years of harsh weather and solitude. Inside, there was a small living area with a wood-burning stove, a kitchen with an old gas range, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed pushed up against the wall. The only light came from propane lanterns and the flickering glow of the fireplace. I spent the first night getting settled. After unloading my bag and the cooler of food I brought, I sat on the porch and listened to the woods. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you know there's no one there. Just the occasional rustling in the underbrush, probably a raccoon or a deer. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than I wanted to admit. The first couple of days were uneventful. I fished in the nearby creek, read by the fire, and took long hikes. I didn't have cell service, but that was part of the appeal. It was nice to be unreachable. At night, I would sit on the porch and watch the stars, sipping whiskey and letting my mind drift. It should have been relaxing, but something felt off. It was subtle at first, a creeping unease that I couldn't shake. Like the air was too still, the silence too deep. On the third night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, just that something had pulled me out of sleep. I lay there, heart pounding, listening. Then I heard it, a faint, steady sound, a tapping. It was coming from outside, near the front of the cabin. I sat up slowly, straining to hear. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate. Not the random scratching of an animal, but something more precise. Tap, tap, tap. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed and clicked it on. The tapping stopped immediately. For a long time, I just sat there, breathing heavily, flashlight pointed at the door. I told myself it was just a branch moving in the wind. But there was no wind, and I knew that sound. It had come from the wooden steps leading up to the porch. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, every creak of the cabin making my skin crawl. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, scanning the area. Nothing seemed out of place. No tracks, no signs of anyone or anything having been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That afternoon, I took a walk, trying to clear my head. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods, further than I had gone before. After about an hour, I came across something that made me stop cold. A small clearing, empty except for a single wooden chair sitting in the center. It was old, weathered, and out of place. There were no houses nearby, no reason for it to be there. As I stood there staring, I noticed something else. Carved into the backrest were 3 deep gouges, like someone had dragged a knife through the wood. My stomach twisted. I turned and walked back to the cabin, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread pressing against my chest. That night, the tapping came again. Louder this time, closer. I sat in the dark, clutching the flashlight, barely breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited until morning before I went outside, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, leading from the woods to my porch. Bare footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows, the door. My stomach dropped. My uncle had said no one lived out here, that I was alone. But someone had been here watching me. I didn't pack. I didn't even bother locking the door. I grabbed my keys, threw my bag in the truck, and left. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, until I saw another car, another human being. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never told my uncle what happened. I don't think I ever will. But I know one thing for sure. I will never go back to that cabin. And I don't care who or what was out there that night. Some things are better left unknown. I should have never gone to that cabin. Looking back, every sign was there, warning me to stay away. But I ignored them, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Now I know better. Started with a simple idea, a weekend alone in the woods to clear my head. Work had been stressful. My personal life was a mess, and I needed to get away from everything. My coworker, Tim, mentioned his uncle owned a cabin deep in the Kentucky woods, about 3 hours outside of Louisville. It was old, isolated, and exactly what I was looking for. When Tim gave me the keys, he laughed and said, "Just don't let the silence get to you." The drive there was peaceful at first. The farther I got from the city, the more the roads narrowed, twisting through thick trees and steep hills. Eventually, the asphalt turned to gravel, then to dirt. My car struggled up the last few miles, tires skidding on loose stones. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows over the clearing. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. 1 story, a covered porch, and a single chimney jutting from the roof. The wood was dark with age, and the windows were cloudy with grime. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but it was mine for the weekend. I killed the engine, grabbed my bags, and stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under my weight. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. The furniture was basic, 1 couch, a small kitchen table, and a fireplace filled with ash. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a tiny bathroom. The place had been cleaned recently, but it still felt stale, like no one had lived here in a long time. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked some canned soup, and read until my eyes felt heavy. When I turned off the lights, the darkness was absolute. I lay in bed listening to the wind in the trees, trying to push away the creeping feeling that I was being watched. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. My heart pounded, and my skin felt cold. I wasn't sure what had startled me. The wind had died down, and the forest outside was silent. Too silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, but the silence pressed down on me. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, rolled over, and forced myself to sleep. The next day, I decided to explore the area. The woods were dense, the trees packed tightly together. Sunlight barely filtered through the branches. I followed a narrow deer trail, stepping carefully over roots and fallen logs. After about a mile, I came across an old hunting stand, its wooden ladder rotting away. Beyond it, I found something stranger, a rusted-out truck, half buried in the undergrowth. It looked like it had been there for decades. The windows were shattered, the doors hanging open. I peered inside and saw old beer cans, a torn-up seat, and something that made my stomach tighten. A single, weathered boot on the passenger side floor. No sign of the other one. I left quickly, my skin crawling. Back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. I told myself it was just an old truck, abandoned by hunters or campers. Still, I double-checked the locks before going to bed that night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. This time, I knew what had woken me. There was a sound outside, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just beyond the porch. I lay frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, a single creak. The sound of weight shifting on the wooden steps. I held my breath. My brain raced through every possibility. An animal? Maybe a bear? No, bears didn't move like that. This was different. This was careful. I reached for my phone, but my hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it. No service. Of course, the signal had cut out miles before I reached the cabin. My only option was to wait. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came, and with it, a thin layer of frost on the ground. I stepped onto the porch and saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints. They led from the tree-line to the cabin, stopping at the steps. But here's the thing, they never left. There were no prints leading away. It was as if whoever or whatever had been there had simply vanished. I packed my bags. I didn't care that it was only Saturday. I didn't care that I had planned to stay until Sunday. Something was wrong with this place. I locked up, threw my stuff in the car, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. Panic bubbled in my chest. I popped the hood, though I had no idea what I was looking for. Everything seemed fine, but the car wouldn't start. I weighed my options. The nearest town was over 10 miles away. Walking meant spending hours alone in the woods, and after last night, that idea made my skin crawl. But I had no choice. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed some water and food inside, and set off. The woods felt different. The silence was heavier, like the trees were watching. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, convinced I heard something behind me. Soft footsteps, a branch snapping, breathing. But when I turned, there was nothing. After what felt like hours, I reached the road. Relief flooded me. I walked faster, my legs aching. Then, ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My car, parked on the side of the road. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I had walked in a straight line. I was sure of it. But there it was, same dent in the bumper, same stickers on the back window. The driver's side door was open. I ran to it, heart pounding. The keys were in the ignition. I slid inside and turned them. The engine roared to life. I didn't question it. I threw the car into drive and sped down the road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, until I saw other cars, other people. Only then did I pull over, hands shaking, lungs burning. I don't know what happened out there. I don't want to know. But I do know this, I'll never go back. And if you ever find yourself near an old cabin in the Kentucky woods, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. I never wanted to spend the weekend at that cabin. It was my brother's idea, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. It'll be good for you, he kept saying. A little break from work, fresh air, no stress. I knew he meant well, but something about the whole thing just rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was because of how quickly he had thrown it together. Just a couple of days before, out of nowhere, he sent me a text saying he had rented a place deep in the woods and that I needed to come. He barely gave me any details, just an address and a time. I should have said no. The drive was long, winding through miles of trees and empty roads. The GPS signal cut out about an hour before I got there, and I had to rely on a printout of directions my brother had emailed me the night before. It felt like I was driving into nowhere, the trees growing thicker, the sky getting darker. It wasn't late, but the heavy clouds overhead made it feel like it was already evening. The air smelled like damp leaves and pine, the kind of scent that should be comforting but, for some reason, wasn't. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was surprised by how isolated it was. There were no other houses, no nearby roads, just a clearing surrounded by towering trees. The cabin itself was small, old-looking, but sturdy. The wood was dark with age, the windows slightly fogged up. My brother's truck was parked out front, but I didn't see him outside. I figured he must be inside already. I stepped out of my car, stretched my legs, and grabbed my bag. The silence was immediate and unsettling. No wind, no birds, just the faint creak of the trees shifting around me. I walked up to the porch, knocked on the door. No answer. I tried the knob, it was unlocked. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic, like rust. The living room was small, a single couch and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A set of stairs led up to what I assumed was a loft, and a narrow hallway to the right led toward the kitchen and bathroom. But my brother wasn't there. His keys were on the table. His jacket was hanging over the back of the couch, but no sign of him. I called his name. No response. Something about the place felt wrong. Not haunted, not supernatural, just wrong. The air felt too still, like the walls were holding something in, something heavy. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal. I figured he might have gone out for firewood or to explore, so I sat down and waited. An hour passed, then two. I walked outside, calling his name, my voice disappearing into the trees. Nothing. The woods stretched in every direction, an endless wall of green and brown. I started walking, just far enough to get a better look, to see if I could spot him anywhere nearby. The ground was damp, soft beneath my boots. Every step felt too loud, every breath too sharp. I found footprints leading away from the cabin, heavy and deep, like he had been moving quickly. I followed them. The deeper I went, the darker it got, the trees blocking out what little light remained. The footprints went on for about 100 yards before they just stopped. No sign of struggle, no other tracks, just an abrupt end, like he had vanished into thin air. My stomach twisted. I turned back, my pace quicker this time. The cabin looked smaller as I approached, swallowed by the growing darkness. I went inside and locked the door. I searched every room, every closet, even under the bed in the loft. Nothing. His things were still there, his bag, his phone on the kitchen counter, half charged. But he was gone. I tried to tell myself he'd come back. Maybe he just got lost. Maybe he'd gone farther than he planned. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Night fell. The cabin felt even smaller in the dark. I kept the lights on, every single one. I built a fire, more for the comfort than the warmth. The silence pressed in from outside, so thick I could almost feel it. Then I heard something. A thud. A single, heavy thud from outside. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too heavy. I moved to the window, careful, slow. The trees stood motionless, their branches barely swaying. The porch was empty, but the sound had come from there, I was sure of it. Another thud, this time closer. I didn't move. My hands were clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. I listened. Nothing. I waited for what felt like an hour, my eyes fixed on the window. But nothing happened. No more sounds. No movement. Just the fire crackling behind me and the steady pound of my own heartbeat. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the sound again. Closer, just outside the door. Morning came slow, gray light creeping in through the windows. My brother was still gone. I had to leave. I knew it. I packed my things fast, shoving them into my bag without caring if anything got folded or put in right. As I grabbed my car keys, I hesitated. My brother's things were still here. His truck was still outside. I couldn't just leave him. I went outside one last time, calling his name until my voice cracked. I walked back to where his footprints had ended. They were still there, unchanged, untouched, like he had just disappeared. I turned back, and that's when I saw it. There was something in the trees, not moving, not making a sound, just standing there watching. A shape, dark and still, barely visible between the branches. It wasn't my brother. I didn't wait. I ran back to the cabin, grabbed my bag, and bolted to my car. The engine turned over slow, too slow, but it started. I backed out fast, kicking up dirt and gravel, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I didn't stop driving. Not when I reached the main road, not when I got back to town. I went straight to the police. They searched, of course, found my brother's truck, his things, his footprints leading into the woods. But nothing else. No sign of him, no sign of anyone else. Just an empty cabin and a stretch of trees that swallowed people whole. I don't know what happened to him. I don't think I ever will. But I know I'll never go back there. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see that shape standing in the trees, waiting. I should have never gone up to that cabin alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and the quiet of the mountains. I'd rented it from a guy online, some little place tucked away deep in the forest, about 30 miles outside of town. The photos made it look nice, small, but cozy. It had a wood-burning stove, a little porch, and a lofted bedroom with big windows that overlooked the trees. The drive up was fine at first. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, twisting through the trees with no sign of any other cabins or houses. It felt isolated, which is what I wanted. I was tired of the city, tired of work, tired of people. I just wanted a break. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked a little rougher than the pictures, like no one had really used it in a while. The wood was weathered, the windows smudged with dust, and the front steps sagged a little under my weight as I walked up. Still, it was fine. I wasn't expecting luxury. Inside, the air was stale, smelled like old wood and dust, but nothing too bad. The furniture was basic, a small couch, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, and a fireplace in the corner. There was a narrow staircase leading up to the loft where the bed was. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, then carried in my stuff. I didn't bring much, just some food, a couple of books, my sleeping bag in case the bed was gross, and my old rifle just for peace of mind. The first few hours were nice. I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the wind in the trees. It was quiet, except for the occasional rustling in the brush, probably just squirrels or deer. It was when the sun started setting that I noticed the first weird thing. There was a path leading from the cabin into the woods, narrow and overgrown. I hadn't really paid attention to it before, but as the light faded, I noticed something off. The grass on either side of the path was flattened down, like something had been walking there. A lot. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. I told myself it was just animals, maybe deer taking the same route every day. I forced myself to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine and went inside to make dinner. That night, I slept lightly. Every little creak of the cabin made me open my eyes. I wasn't scared, exactly, but something about the place felt wrong. At some point in the night, I woke up suddenly, not to a noise, but to the feeling that something was different. The air inside the cabin felt colder. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate, not an animal, not the random rustling of the forest. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The rifle was downstairs, leaning against the wall by the door. I cursed myself for not bringing it up with me. The footsteps moved around the cabin, slow and careful. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They were taking their time. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped right outside the front door. Silence. I wanted to get up, grab the rifle, but I was scared that any movement would give me away. The door was locked, but the locks on this place were old. A good shove and they'd probably snap right off. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps started again. This time moving away from the cabin, back toward the woods. I stayed awake for hours listening, waiting. Eventually, Exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. Morning came, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But when I went outside, I saw them. Footprints. They circled the cabin. Bare footprints. Human. I wanted to leave right then, but I told myself it was probably just some local messing with me. Maybe some drifter passing through. Maybe a hunter. Maybe just some guy who didn't realize the cabin was rented out. I should have left, but I didn't. Instead, I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my head. I followed the overgrown path a little way into the woods, just to see where it led. It didn't go far, just a few hundred yards before stopping at a small clearing. In the center of the clearing, there was a fire pit. Around it, old beer bottles, cigarette butts, scraps of cloth. Like people had been camping here, but not recently. As I stood there, looking around, I felt the same unease from the night before, like I was being watched. The trees were silent. No birds, no wind, just heavy, pressing quiet. I turned and walked back to the cabin, trying not to rush. That night, I kept the rifle next to me. I didn't sleep. At around 2 a.m., I heard them again. Footsteps. This time, they didn't stop at the door. They moved around the cabin, slow and careful. Then scratching. Not loud, just a faint, deliberate scrape along the wooden walls. I gripped the rifle so tight my hands hurt. My throat was dry. I wanted to call out, to yell, but something in me said that was a bad idea. The scratching moved along the wall, toward the back of the cabin. I forced myself to move. I crept down the stairs, careful to avoid the squeaky spots. When I reached the door, I waited, listening. The scratching stopped. I threw the door open, rifle raised. Nothing, just the trees and the wind. The clearing empty, no movement, but the footprints were there again. This time, there were more of them. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and stayed awake until dawn. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my stuff, threw it in the truck, and got the hell out of there. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the trees, just before the cabin disappeared from sight, I saw them. 3 figures, standing still, watching me leave, barefoot. I never went back. I don't know why I even said yes. I think about that a lot. Maybe it was the way James made it sound easy. A few days in the woods, some time to reset, a break from the noise of everyday life. We'd hunted together before, gone fishing, done the whole outdoorsman thing since we were kids, so it didn't seem out of the ordinary. But something about this trip was different. I just didn't realize it yet. It was October 2018. We planned a 4-day stay in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. James had booked it online. Some old hunting lodge that had been around since the 60s but had recently been opened for rentals. The pictures looked decent. A little run down, but nothing we couldn't handle. The drive took longer than expected. By the time we left the main road, the sun was already setting. The dirt trail leading to the cabin was rough, full of deep potholes and loose gravel. My truck rattled the whole way, the headlights barely cutting through the trees as the darkness closed in. We arrived just after 7 p.m. The cabin was small, a single-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch. The forest pressed in close, the trees tall and silent, blocking out most of the evening light. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs of life except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Inside, the place was simple. A living area with an old wood stove, a tiny kitchen with outdated appliances, and a single bedroom with 2 creaky twin beds. The walls smelled like damp wood and something else, something faint but unpleasant, like mildew or old sweat. I figured it was just the age of the place. The first night was fine. We drank a few beers, made a fire outside, talked about work, relationships, all the usual stuff. By midnight, we turned in, the sound of the wind through the trees lulling me to sleep. The next morning, I woke early. James was still out cold, so I stepped outside for some fresh air. The forest was dead silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just an eerie, heavy stillness. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just the time of year. We spent most of the day hiking and scouting areas for hunting. Around noon, we came across something strange, a pile of bones. At first, I thought it was a deer carcass, but as I got closer, I saw that the bones had been arranged into a neat little stack. No sign of fur, no blood, just dry, bleached bones piled deliberately in the middle of a clearing. James nudged me. Coyotes, maybe? I nodded, but something about it felt off. I'd seen animals pick a carcass clean before, but this wasn't scattered remains. It was organized, like someone had taken the time to place them there. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence was unnerving. Usually, you hear something, owls, raccoons, the distant howl of a coyote, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Then, at some point in the middle of the night, I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. I know that for sure. The sound was slow, deliberate, like footsteps crunching over dead leaves. I sat up, listening. James was still snoring. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed and clicked it on. The beam barely reached the front window. I couldn't see anything, just darkness and the faint outline of trees. I told myself it was my imagination, that the stillness of the woods was getting to me, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, we went deeper into the forest. We weren't talking much. I think we both felt the weight of something neither of us wanted to say out loud. Around noon, we stumbled across an old structure, what looked like the remains of a fire lookout tower. It was falling apart, the wooden beams rotting, the stairs leading up to the platform barely holding together. James wanted to check it out. I didn't, but I wasn't about to say no and look like a coward. Inside, the place was empty, except for an old metal chair sitting in the middle of the platform. The weird part, the chair was clean. No rust, no dust, no leaves piled up around it like you'd expect from something left abandoned for decades. Someone had been here, recently. That night, the noises outside started again. This time, James heard them too. He sat up in bed, his eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. I didn't answer. We just sat there, listening. The footsteps were slow, circling the cabin. Every few seconds, they would stop like whoever or whatever it was pausing to listen. I grabbed my hunting rifle. James did the same. Then suddenly, the footsteps stopped. We waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won, and we fell asleep, rifles still in our hands. The next morning, we found tracks in the dirt. Not boot prints, bare feet, human, but something was wrong. The prints were deep, the toes splayed too wide, like whoever made them had been walking barefoot for years. That was enough for me. I told James we needed to go. He didn't argue. We packed up fast, barely speaking. As we drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something standing at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty woods stretching behind us. We never talked about it again. Not really. Every now and then, James will bring up the trip, but only in passing. "Hey, remember that cabin?" he'll say with a forced laugh, and I'll nod, pretending it was just another hunting trip. But I still think about those footprints, about the silence in those woods, about the feeling that we weren't alone. I haven't been back to the deep woods since. I don't know if I'll ever get another good night's sleep again after what happened in that cabin. I haven't told anyone the full story, not because I think they wouldn't believe me, but because I don't want to relive it. But maybe writing it down will help. It was late October a couple of years ago. The air had that sharp, crisp feeling that meant winter wasn't far off. I had taken a week off work and decided to spend it alone at a cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It belonged to an old coworker who had moved out of state and wasn't using it anymore. He told me I could stay there whenever I wanted, and after a few stressful months at my job, I figured I needed the break. No cell service, no internet, just me, some books, and nature. Sounded perfect. The drive out was long and empty. I passed through a couple of small towns, but for the last hour, I saw nothing but dense trees and the occasional deer darting across the road. The directions he gave me were mostly correct, but the last stretch was a narrow dirt road that looked barely used. The tires crunched over fallen leaves, and my car bounced on the uneven ground. Just as I was starting to wonder if I had taken a wrong turn, the cabin appeared through the trees. It was nothing fancy, just a simple one-story structure made of dark, weathered wood. The front porch sagged a little and the windows were dark. A small clearing surrounded it, but beyond that, the forest pressed in close. It felt isolated. Peaceful, I told myself. I unlocked the door, stepping inside. The air was stale, but everything seemed in order. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall. A small kitchen sat off to the side, and a short hallway led to a single bedroom and bathroom. It had everything I needed. I spent the first couple of days hiking, reading, and enjoying the solitude. The woods were silent, apart from the occasional rustling of animals and the wind shifting through the trees. At night, it was even quieter. No cars, no distant hum of a city, just the absolute stillness of the forest. I had never felt so alone. It started the third night. I woke up suddenly, the kind of wake up where you're not sure why your brain decided you needed to be alert. I lay still, listening. The cabin creaked occasionally, but nothing seemed out of place. Then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. Leaves crunching outside. Slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath, listening. Could have been an animal. Probably was. But something felt off. The footsteps weren't quick or random like a deer or a raccoon. They were steady, like a person walking carefully. I sat up, heart hammering, and reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. I pointed it toward the window, but the old blinds made it impossible to see outside. The footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it had just been my imagination. Maybe a branch had fallen or I had been dreaming. I lay back down and, after what felt like hours, drifted off again. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for signs of anything unusual. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, so I couldn't tell if anything had been disturbed. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone had been out there, watching. I spent the day hiking farther than before, trying to distract myself. By the time I got back, the sun was setting. I made dinner, read for a bit, and tried to put the night before out of my mind. But as I got into bed, that same unease crept in. I kept the flashlight close and made sure the door was locked before I finally closed my eyes. I woke up again. This time I knew why. The footsteps were back, closer. My stomach dropped. I could hear them right outside the bedroom window. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. The sound was unmistakable, slow, careful steps moving through the leaves. I turned my head slightly, staring at the window. The blinds were down, but I swore I saw the faintest outline of something outside. Someone. I reached slowly for the flashlight, my fingers gripping it tightly. My mind raced. Should I call out? Was it just my imagination? Then, as if whoever was out there knew I was awake, the footsteps stopped. The silence stretched on. I sat there, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I checked around the cabin again, and this time I saw it. Footprints. Real human footprints in the dirt, leading from the tree line to my window. I felt sick. Someone had been standing there, watching me. I couldn't brush it off anymore. I packed my bag, threw it in the car, and left. I didn't care about the rest of my stuff. I could replace it. I just needed to get out of there. As I drove back down the dirt road, I looked in my rearview mirror. Just before the cabin disappeared behind the trees, I swore I saw something. Someone. Standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. I never went back.